Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be able to welcome you to today's webinar, which is called Optimise Your Customer's Experience with Microsoft Azure AD B2C. We've got lots of really great stuff to cover this afternoon, but I'd like to kick things off by making some quick introductions to myself and my colleague Dave, as we'll be chatting through all things B2C with you. So I'm Fiona. I work in the commercial team at Candatis as a business development executive. I've been with the company for around 7 months now, and my main responsibility is to work with clients across lots of different business sectors to help them with wherever they are in their digital identity journey. Once it gets to the more technical stuff, that's normally my opportunity to bring in one of my super smart colleagues, and luckily I've got one of them with me to chat to you today, so I'll pass over to Dave to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Downs. I'm one of the tech leads at Candatis. I specialise more in the Microsoft B2C side of things. So working with Microsoft's Azure AD B2C platform, talking with clients, talking with our dev teams about, what the client requirements are, how we can best facilitate those with B2C and deliver solutions of varying sizes.
Brilliant, thanks Dave. So now that you've met Dave and I'd like to just give you a brief overview of Candatis and what it is that we do. So we're a team of identity experts who focus in identity and access management, or IAM for short. Most of the team tend to work from home nowadays, and we're kind of dotted around the UK, but we do have a lovely office in Leith in Edinburgh, which we use mostly for seeing clients and of course for the odd social event, which is always a nice way to kind of bring us together in person. It's amazing how many people will show up in the office if there's the promise of beer and pizza. But beer and pizza aside, we're a Microsoft Gold partner, which means that our team of engineers are highly skilled in what they do. Our business enhances Microsoft Entra products, and we're specialists in Entra Verified ID and external identities. We work with our clients to provide consultancy, development and support services to ensure that they've got the best possible identity solutions in place. And one of our key focus areas is the Microsoft Azure AD B2C platform, which of course is part of Microsoft Entra. And we're going to demonstrate today how this can help to solve some of the common identity challenges that businesses face. We'll be exploring 6 key areas on this topic, and we'll chat a little about each of them in turn. So the areas that we'll look to cover are knowing your customer, federation, governance and building your trust framework, identity protection, data, and modern security standardization. So just before we dive in terms of housekeeping, the session today will be recorded and we'll send you a link once the recording is ready. We have also allocated some time at the end for questions, so please do use the Q&A box if there's anything at all that you would like to ask us. So without further ado, let's get started with our first topic today, which is knowing your customer. The first key area that we look at when we're designing identity and access management solutions is who are the users? The reason for this is that this thought process helps drive what solutions we build, what the solutions that we build need to do. But can you explain, Dave, what businesses should be considering when it comes to understanding who their users are?
Sure. So the first thing is probably key to understand is what we're talking about with these kind of solutions are solutions that secure systems, right? Primarily in our context, that's going to be web apps, so websites, APIs, things like that. When it comes to thinking about like your customers, about your users, probably the first split that's best to think about is, do you have internal users? Do you have external users? So external users often have their own credentials, so like an email address or password that they use specifically to access your solution, your system, whatever it is that's being secured. They might have an external directory, an external store, something like Azure Active Directory if you're dealing with an organization outside of your own organization. But they are, all these people are external to your organization. Internal users are those users within your own organization. More than likely, they're going to exist on some existing directory. So something like Azure Active Directory is one that we see quite often. And there's usually a difference between how these two groups want to use the system, right? So external users are usually coming to access some function that you provide. So let's say an e-commerce store, they want to come and they want to buy things. Internal users usually want to either manage the system, manage those users, perform admin functions, but they might also be actual users of the system themselves. So it's important to kind of distinguish between those two groups and figure out, okay, do we have either of those two groups? Do we have a mix of both? And what can they do? Now, there was another distinction in there that some people might have picked up on, and that's a difference between what we call B2C, business to customer users, and B2B, business to business users. Now, B2C, your system is primarily for customers, individual users who want to access your system. So if you are thinking of something like an e-commerce system, someone coming to buy something, they've got an account, they've got an order history, things like that. They are a customer, that's a business to customer interaction. You are interacting with that one individual. B2B, that's where you're interacting with an organization who have their own users, and you're bringing that collection of users onto the system and authorizing the entire set of users or some subset of users. There's differences in how those two sets want to be managed that we might get onto in a bit, but it's important to note that there's that distinction as well as kind of internal and external. So by running through all of that and figuring out, okay, where do my customers, which boxes do they fall into, you can figure out how they're going to use the system and make the solution, the identity access management solution, make sense to those users.
Okay, cool. So once we understand who the users are, then how does that understanding then translate through to the implementation of the IAM solution?
Yep, so when we're talking about Microsoft Azure AD B2C, it supports its own local credentials, which can be used for external users. So that's an email address and a password, a username and a password. Those credentials can be stored in B2C's own user directory. They could be stored externally and then accessed via some kind of API. So maybe there's a legacy SQL database somewhere containing a big old history of all the users that you've ever interacted with. They've got credentials, and B2C can then hook into that using an API. And a lot of the time we write kind of bridging APIs between B2C and those stores, so you can make use of your existing data without, compromising the fact that you want to use B2C. By having your own, or by your customers having their own credentials dedicated to the solution, they can securely control those credentials just for that solution. They can have their own email address, their own password set up just for that particular solution, whatever it is. Now, B2C also supports federation. That's primarily used for internal users, but it might also be used for external users who've got their own identity store. So that could be something like Azure Active Directory, social providers like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the rest. In terms of Azure AD B2C, it'll connect with anything that supports OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, SAML 2, so very popular identity standards. And the benefit of using some external identity is it allows users to reuse an existing identity that they've already got. If I'm a B2B user, and my organization is using your system, it's very useful for me to be able to reuse my organization's identity because I'm probably already signed into it. When it comes to the split between B2C and B2B, typically Microsoft's Azure AD B2C platform focuses on the B2C side, as the name implies, but the latter is possible as well. It just depends on the use case, and you're probably mixing and matching between the two depending on exactly what your solution is, what systems you're integrating with, and so on. So you might accomplish it with federation out to external directories, where that external directory provides the actual identity, the roles, the groups that users are in, and then B2C just makes use of that information and standardizes it. It might be that you supplement the B2C integration like we do with custom policies, with custom logic in separate management portals where you can manage users in bulk as part of an organization with appropriate multi-tenant controls and role-based access control and things like that.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Dave. One of the things that you mentioned there was federation, which is always an interesting one, and it's actually the second key area that we would like to explore in a bit more detail today. So I wondered just if you could expand a wee bit more just on what exactly federation is and what it means for customers.
So it's best to think of it primarily in terms of there's some existing identity that's stored outside of, in this case, B2C, right? So that might be an organization directory, like we talked about, so Azure Active Directory. It might be a social provider, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, all the rest. What you do is you register a link between B2C and whatever that identity provider is, so between B2C and Google, say. Now, the actual nature of that link is going to be different depending on the standards that are used. So we talked about OpenID Connect, OAuth, SAML. They've all got a slightly different way of setting that link up and making the requests and things like that. But you don't have to worry about that. B2C will take care of all of that. You just need to kind of register that link. What that allows B2C to do is to then make a request to that identity provider, so to Google, to Azure Active Directory, to authenticate the user and receive a response. So the way it works is your user arrives at your application, the thing they want to use. That application says, oh, well, you need to be authenticated. I don't know how to sign you in, but I know B2C does, so I'll redirect you over there. That in itself is federation, right? The app's saying, I don't know how to authenticate you, but I know a system that does. I'm going to send you there and trust it to do it. When you arrive at B2C, B2C is then going to run through whatever its logic is, and let's say, it wants to do its own federation. So it's going to then redirect you again out to the identity provider, Google, Azure Active Directory, wherever, to actually do the authentication. When you get there, that's then going to do the authentication. So, signing with my work credentials to Azure Active Directory, signing with my Gmail account for Google, whatever it is. You go through all of your steps there, and then ultimately that identity provider redirects you back to B2C, because B2C is the thing that said, I want you to authenticate. B2C checks that response, says, did it come from where I asked you to go to? Am I expecting it? Has it expired? A big long list of questions. Assuming it's all okay, that will then create its own response back to the original application. And then the original application says, okay, great, I've received your response, you signed in.
Okay, cool. So with that journey in mind then, does that mean that B2C can delegate responsibility for signing the user in?
Ultimately, yes. In the same way that the application is delegating responsibility for signing in the user as well. B2C is still ultimately responsible from the app's point of view. So the app trusts B2C to authenticate the user using whatever process B2C deems necessary. It's B2C that in turn trusts that onward identity provider, so Google or Azure Active Directory or wherever it is, to actually do the authentication. Provided that identity provider returns a signed in user back to B2C, and B2C can complete its checks to verify that's all, correct, it's secure, it's not been tampered with, anything like that. B2C can then return the signed in user back to the relying party. So what you end up with is this chain of trust, right? The app trusts B2C, B2C trusts the identity provider, the app doesn't ever need to know about that identity provider, doesn't need to know anything about Google as your Active Directory, it just needs to know about B2C. From a user's point of view, that allows them to securely reuse their existing identities. Because if I've already got a Google account, it's much more secure for me to continue using that Google account than maybe set up another account with a username and password. We know how everyone is with password security, right? It's very easy to reuse a password. So let's just make use of an identity they've already got. They don't need to maintain multiple passwords, and it's very low friction if they're already signed in. So if I'm on my work PC, I'm going to be signed into Azure Active Directory because I'm doing lots of work things throughout the day. So if an application also makes use of Azure Active Directory, when it redirects me over there, AAD is just going to say, oh, well, you're already signed in. I don't need to prompt you to enter your details again. I don't need to prompt you for MFA or, whatever the process is. I'll just redirect you straight back to the app with a great, you're signed in. So from my point of view, accessing the app, I've come to the app. My browser's redirected a couple of times. I've seen a couple of blank pages, but then I'm straight back into the app, signed in. I haven't had to do anything. I haven't had to enter my credentials again. So it's very easy from a user's point of view to kind of reuse those sessions that already exist.
Yeah, no, absolutely, that makes sense. And it sounds as though there's definitely an element of trust involved here, which I suppose brings us on to our discussion around governance and building a trust framework. So I wondered if you could maybe tell us a wee bit more just about what a trust framework actually is, and why would this be something that's important for identity and for businesses?
So a trust framework you can think of as a set of standards, a set of processes that businesses use to ensure that users are who they say they are, right? That you're defining the processes that users need to go through to verify their identity, and then what that means for the calling applications. Now, that might also include process around how that differs depending on context. So if I need to access an application, maybe there's a trust framework around just accessing it. Maybe the trust framework explains, well, if you need to access a more sensitive area, then there's a particular process that a user needs to go through to more thoroughly verify their identity, and how the application can be sure that that identity has then been more thoroughly verified. Rather than coming up with them from scratch, it's often useful to make use of existing public standards. So in the UK, there's something called GPG 44, which is all about using authenticators to protect your online service. And then there's another one called GPG 45, which is all about verifying your user's identity, proving that they are a particular individual.
Okay, perfect. So in practical terms then, what does it mean to define a trust framework?
So if we think about the first one for a second, that GPG 44, the use of authenticators. So that's describing how a user can authenticate into your app, right? So you usually want to use at least one of a number of authentication factors, right? So there's something that you know, so a PIN number and a password. Yeah, that's pretty common way of accessing a website, enter your email address and password. Something that you have, so that's things like authenticator applications, like you get Microsoft Authenticator on your app, where you scan the QR code and you get the rotating number that you have to enter. It might be a physical hardware token that you plug into your PC. Then there's things that you are, something you are. So that's biometrics, your thumbprint to access your phone, or facial recognition. Now, it might be that your trust framework doesn't define that you've just got to supply one of those. You might want to have combinations of them. So quite a common thing is, let's capture a PIN number or a password, and then have a second factor, maybe an authenticator app that you've also got to enter your code from. So you end up with this multi-factor authentication where you're not trusting any one source, which could be more easily compromised, but a number of different factors to ensure that the authenticating user, the person signing in, is probably the person that should be signing in. Now, to go along with all of that, you've got a concept of level of assurance, right? Which is really just a measure of how sure am I that the person sat at the computer doing the typing is the person that I'm expecting. And your trust framework will define how each of those things, how all of those different factors kind of tie together to provide a level of assurance to those relying party applications, the thing that actually wants the signed in user, to demonstrate to that application, look, this is a user that you can trust to whatever level. So going back to the payments thing, if I need to access just the website, maybe I only need a level of assurance of 1. And maybe all I need to do to get that is just enter an email address and password. If I want to access something to do with payments, maybe I need a level of assurance of 2. And to do that, maybe I need my email address and password, but then a second factor like a one-time passcode via SMS, or a number entered for an authenticator app, or something like that. Your trust framework kind of defines what all of that means and what processes you need to go through to attain those different levels, and what having a different level means. One of the important things here is to think about what the users will expect, right? So if I'm accessing a website, maybe I'll expect an email address and a password, maybe with a second factor like an authenticator app. If I'm accessing something on my phone, maybe I'm more likely to expect biometrics, access it via my thumbprint or facial recognition, because those are inherently part of me accessing my phone. That in turn might have an impact on your level of assurance and things like that. But at that point, it's not just a security decision, it's also a usability decision. How are my users expected to use this thing, and what does that mean for the security of it? Now, going back to the other GPG that we touched on briefly, GPG 45, that's more about what we call identity verification, and that's proving that I am Dave the person, rather than the person signing in has access to Dave's account. So that usually, when we're talking about B2C at least, involves calling off to third-party services during your authentication, during your registration. It can be document-based, so things like having to provide a driving license, a passport, a photo to check against existing sources, and those things get passed along to those third parties who can then check the documents against existing stores, against government databases and things like that. You've got to give consideration to how that flow works, because if we need to capture those documents and then send them off there and have some checks run, are those checks automated? Are they going to take a long time? What does that mean for the user trying to access the system? If we're waiting on me proving that I am Dave, am I still allowed access into the system in a more limited way? Am I stopped from accessing it until all those document checks come back and I've fixed any issues or anything like that? So there's a whole usability consideration again around that. It's not just a security decision. You've also got to think about, especially with that, what kind of documents, what kind of proofs are your users going to have? It's no use saying, well, we're going to use driving license and passport if the majority of the users, or even a significant subset of the users, don't have access to a driving license or a passport. So there's lots of considerations that need to go into kind of establishing these trust frameworks and what they mean in practice for your specific system, for your specific users.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave. So it sounds then like the goals of the trust framework are to protect the client's system from being misused, but I guess also to protect the user's identity. Identity protection is actually the next topic that I'd like to look at today. So I wonder if you can maybe explain a wee bit more just about how this tends to work in practice with B2C.
Yep. So we've talked about usernames and passwords a little bit. So B2C will store passwords securely in its own directory. It doesn't allow you to retrieve them once they've been saved. When you're talking about custom policies and doing all of the user journey logic in B2C, the page that you capture the password on is the page that you've got to use it on. So you've got to save it against the directory as soon as you capture it. It won't allow you to keep it for use throughout the process. So it's not hanging around. It can't be captured, those kind of things. B2C also itself supports processes for detecting password attacks, doing things like blocking accounts and various other mitigations. We've also talked about external identity providers, so your Azure Active Directories, your Googles and so on. That moves some of the responsibility for identity protection away from B2C in this case and out to those systems. So for example, Azure Active Directory, when B2C redirects you over to Azure Active Directory, your account administrator is going to set up policies that dictate things like, do you just need to sign in with username and password? Do you also need to perform MFA? And that might be dependent on your location, the device you're signing into, whether you're on the company network, all those usual kind of things. So your identity provider is going to have a level of identity protection itself built into it. Now, that doesn't mean that the B2C centered identity solution doesn't also need to have its own protections in, but you need to be aware of what you're getting for free almost from your identity provider and then complement that. Again, it also makes sense for your users, right? You don't want to be double prompting them for MFA if they've already done it in Azure Active Directory. You might not have all the data, you might need to ask them again. It becomes a very difficult process for users to go through. So managing security and usability kind of hand in hand. B2C itself, like I say, supports MFA. So it will support the generation and verification of one-time passcodes, which you can send via SMS or email or other external services that have APIs. It supports TOTP, time-based one-time passcode authenticator apps. So that's your Microsoft authenticators, your Google authenticators, those apps where you scan the QR code and then you get that rotating number that you have to type into the website. It'll also integrate with something called WebAuthn, which is it works through your browser, and that allows you to integrate with FIDO tokens and biometrics through the device that you're actually signing in from. B2C will also integrate with external third-party services as long as you're using the custom policies. So that might be custom email and SMS providers, so like SendGrid, MailJet. We've used GovUK Notify for like government clients. That allows you to send all of your notifications, all your one-time passcode emails using branded emails. So users, again, are a little bit more sure that that's coming from you as part of their authentication journey. So again, it helps build trust, helps make sure that they know the system they're using. It'll integrate with custom authenticators. So things like Authy, Duo, push notifications, really anything that's got an API, you can kind of build a flow around. It'll also integrate with identity verification systems. So that's going back to that document capture and verification. So we've done integrations with things like Onfido, where you embed a web SDK in the page that captures all the documents. It then sends those documents off to the Onfido servers for processing. And then there's a server-to-server communication to say, okay, have those documents been processed? Was it successful? Are there any notifications we need to send to users? Are they allowed in? And so on. And then there's a B2C process around that for, okay, once the users complete those checks, what happens? The B2C custom policies are what allow you to support a range, a mix of different approaches to meet different needs. So it's not just a case of saying, oh, well, we want MFA, we want identity protection, we want, you know, this, that, or the other. It's how do they go together into a usable journey for a user? Are they built in? Are they third party? How do we bring all of that together in a way that makes sense and is secure?
Brilliant. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. We know from experience then that a lot of businesses are interested in user risk scoring or using information about when and where a user signs in to prompt them for additional checks or to raise notifications to the user or sometimes to support staff. So I wondered, how does B2C ensure that this can be facilitated, and does this relate to identity protection?
So B2C comes with Azure AD conditional access. As this is the same kind of conditional access that you see over in Azure Active Directory itself. And what that's doing is it's going through a three-step process. It first captures signals. So that's things like, is the user a specific user? Are they in a specific group? Where are they signing in from? Is it a particular location, or is it not a particular location? Are they using a particular device? And then have Microsoft identified that it's a particularly risky user or a particularly risky sign-in? Based on those signals, it will then make a decision about that user, about that sign-in, based on policies that you set up. So you can set up policies like, is a user signing in from our office IP address or not from our office IP address? And maybe the policy says, well, if they're not signing in from the office IP address, then we're going to prompt them for MFA. So the decision that it comes to is, if you're not coming from this IP address, prompt for MFA. Based on those decisions, B2C, the custom policies, can then perform the enforcement. So if the decision is perform MFA, the custom policies are responsible for saying, okay, for this particular user, what does MFA mean? Do I need to send them a one-time passcode to the mobile number? Do I need to prompt them for a one-time passcode via an authenticator app? Do I need to send them a push notification based on, you know, what the user set up, what the journey supports, and all things like that? You can also integrate B2C with third-party systems. So we've done that with things like fingerprint.js. So that again will capture a number of signals about the user. So device they're using, IP address, browser, even things like how they use the browser can be captured. And that we've done things like build up a fingerprint of this is a particular user using a particular browser, using a particular device. And then we make decisions like, okay, have we seen that combination before? Have we seen Dave signing in from his work PC using Chrome? If not, then we make a particular decision about, okay, well, what does that mean? What do we want to do off the back of that? And again, we can do an enforcement action in B2C with the custom policies. So in that case, if we detect that Dave is using a new browser on a new device, maybe we send an email to the registered email address saying, hey, looks like you've signed in from somewhere new. If this is you, great, don't worry, ignore this email, just delete it. If it's not you, maybe you want to go to your account, sign in for real, set up 2FA, whatever the actual process is that we want the user to go through there. We can be a little bit more flexible there, right? Because the Azure AD conditional access basically gives you one of three outcomes. Either they're blocked, MFA, or change your password, or I suppose don't do anything. With the third-party systems, you can maybe be a little bit more flexible, and you can use the two in combination as well. So you could use the Azure AD part for all of the stuff that it does well, and then a third-party system to supplement that for like new device detection and things like that. Ultimately, it allows you to protect the customer accounts from malicious authentications and do things like notify users when there's potentially suspicious activity on their account. So you're helping to protect their identities by not allowing users in who claim to be that user but can't prove that they are.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave. So we've talked a lot about credentials and security, but I guess one of the other key areas for businesses is their users' data. They want to keep track of how it's stored, where it's stored, and how it's used. So what kinds of approaches do you normally see for storing and handling user data in the IAM solutions that we build for our customers?
So there's usually a range of different approaches to data, a range of different data stores. The primary one to talk about is probably B2C's own user directory. So that's where we'll store at the very least the credentials for the user. So username and password, a link out to the external identity provider if they've signed in there. So maybe some unique ID linking that user to Google. So when they sign in with Google, we know, okay, which user is it? You can also store personally identifiable information. So like say your email address, if you're signing with email address and password, but things like forename, surname, phone numbers, a variety of different information related to that user. If there's anything that doesn't come kind of built into the directory itself, you can also add custom attributes. So that might be additional PII attributes that aren't captured automatically. So like let's say address details, maybe alternative email addresses, alternative phone numbers. It might be things that are specific to the application. So maybe you want to store a date they last signed in or some ID out to another data store as part of that user directory. Those might be stored as custom attributes. The advantage of using the B2C directory is that it's all controlled and secured by Microsoft as part of hosting that B2C tenant. So you don't have to worry about backing the data up. You don't have to worry about the redundancy, the reliability of it, the availability of it. Microsoft take care of all of that, and they've got very detailed documentation around exactly the process they go through when you're writing to the directory, how that gets replicated across different stores within a region, what happens when things go down, all that kind of stuff. Now, you might want to use other data stores as well. So one of the primary ones we see is CMSs, so content or customer management systems. Typically, that's where the user has a record of all of their customers, not just in terms of how they're authenticating onto the system, but how they're using the system generally. So going back to our e-commerce example from the start, maybe the order history, maybe the history of like returns, support interactions, maybe all of that's stored in the CMS, and part of the authentication journey either creates that record initially, pulls information from that record, makes various things available to the calling applications. So there's often an integration with systems like that. You've also got all the legacy data stores. So what we see quite often is people want to move to something like B2C from an existing handwritten solution where they've got an SQL database that's storing user credentials and they want to move to B2C because it's more secure. Well, maybe there's a period of time where they want users to be authenticating, still using that database while they migrate everyone over. So we'll either use existing APIs, we'll write our own bridging APIs so that B2C can make its own back-end authentication calls into that directory, into that SQL database, check the username and password, move everything over onto B2C. So B2C can pull data from multiple different data stores. So it can pull them from the CMS, from those databases, from its own directory, ultimately looking to give a definitive token back to the application that initiated the authentication request to say, this is this person, this is who they are, here are, at the very least, a minimal set of details that you might need to know about them. In a lot of cases, we'll supplement that with custom APIs. So given a token from B2C, some bit of information that says this is an authenticated user, here's some details about them. Maybe there's some custom API calls that applications can make to say, okay, give me their full permission set, give me some more details about them, give me their order history, things like that. And it all kind of makes use of that authentication system, makes use of the tokens being generated from that authentication system to make sure it's secure, to make sure everything knows what it needs to about the user when it needs to know it. Now, what we would say is, as part of all of this, consolidate wherever possible, right? So a lot of customers do have data stored in a range of different places. One of the primary reasons people are looking at B2C is because they've got, let's say, a dozen different applications, each of which have their own user store, each of which, is a separate database held by a particular team. They use different methods of storing passwords, storing user data, and they want to replace all that with B2C as the one store. By doing that, by storing data in ideally one, maybe two places, it becomes much easier to manage that data and to make sure that it's not going to be leaked. It's not going to be an issue for GDPR and compliance issues. If you pull it all into one or two sources, then kind of inherently you're putting under the control of one or two teams, right? So you've only got to trust a very small set of people, a very small set of processes to actually handle that data correctly. And you can be much more sure that user data specifically, PII, is being handled correctly, that it's being secured correctly, that it's not going to leak. Now, as part of all of that, whenever you're moving data around, that means that you need to have to plan in migrations. Right? You need to plan how we're going to get all the data from these disparate systems into the one or two sources of truth. And that might be things like a bulk migration. We want to take it all ahead of time. It might be a just-in-time migration as users sign in. We want to take it over. It might be a combination of both. We usually see that with passwords, right? We can take over the entire user record from an existing store, but taking over a hashed password doesn't really mean anything to B2C. It's very hard to verify. So as users signing in, we do a check against their existing hash password, and providing that's okay, we store the password newly hashed inside B2C, all nice and secure from that point. So you need to have plans for where is your data, where do you want your data to be, how are you going to move it, and then how are you going to ultimately manage it to make sure it's all secure.
Brilliant, thank you. I suppose I know from my own experience of speaking with clients that so much data being captured and moved between all the systems that they have, they are often very mindful of the GDPR implications, as you've mentioned there. There's normally specific compliance requirements that they have for their data. So I wondered what kind of thing would be handled by the IAM solution, and if so, what impact does that have on the users?
Yep, so it's probably important to say that when it comes to things like GDPR, things like compliant, we generally recommend take a holistic approach across the entire solution, right? It's generally not just down to the IAM component to manage the user data, to handle the user data. Every component that uses PII, all that user data, should be aware of what it's doing and why it's doing it and how it should be handling the data. So everything needs to be aware of what data is being processed, how is it being processed, where is that data being stored, what's the purpose for collection. And for customers, the key and where it starts to come into more of the identity management part is how are their rights met, probably primarily through the authentication and identity management system. And that goes back again to knowing your customer, right? What different kind of customers that you have, different kind of users that you have. So if you've got customers, people come into your e-commerce system to buy things, for example, users are going to expect self-service actions. So I'm going to register to your application. I'm going to enter all of my personal information. I'm going to want to be able to update that personal information myself. I might want to be able to delete my account, request all of my data and how it's being used and things like that. So I want a lot of self-service management functions that it probably makes sense for the identity and access management part of the solution to actually surface to me. If we're talking more about the B2B side of things, we've got organizations that are signing up, and then those organizations have users, then maybe it's less likely to be self-service actions, self-service interactions. Maybe there's a small set of admin users in that organization that need to manage the user's data. So they're responsible for who they can manage, what they can manage, what they can request. Maybe they can do that using B2C's Graph API. Maybe they don't get access to the underlying data store with Graph API, but there's custom portals or custom APIs that we provide on top of B2C, on top of Graph API, that can then do like multi-tenant filtering and making sure that a user, an admin user organization only has access to specific groups of users, or things like that. Maybe it's a mix of both. Plus there might be additional tools. So things like processes running in the background to anonymize data or delete data over time, so you're not keeping any personal information longer than you need to. Because if you've got personal information just kind of sitting around that's not being used, it's really much more of a liability than it is an asset. If it gets breached for whatever reason, if it gets leaked for whatever reason, then a bunch of people's PII is going to be going out that didn't need to be, because it's not needed.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Thank you. So moving on to our final topic of the day then, which is modern security standardization. You explained that the solutions that we build can define the processes for how data is handled and cover GDPR and other compliance requirements, but how is that data kept secure?
Yep, so as with really any modern systems nowadays, what we're really talking about there, I think, is making sure all communication is encrypted in transit. So making sure all your inter-component API calls, everything like that is using things like HTTPS, making sure TLS 1.2 at least is enforced, maybe 1.3 if it's available. Where you're using 1.2, any old ciphers, any compromised ciphers are all disabled, things like that. You've also then got the counterpart to that, which is encryption at rest. So if there is any data being stored in databases, making sure that those databases encrypt that data at rest, especially if there's PII in there. Again, that goes back to if you're using CMSs, if you're using B2C Zone Directory, chances are that's taken care of automatically for you. So that's another kind of headache that you don't have to think about. And then password handling, right? So going back to what we were saying about with B2C, that kind of handles passwords for you securely by default. So just making sure you're aware of how passwords specifically are being moved around the system, where they're available, making sure they're secured. They shouldn't be reversible. They should be salted and hashed, and all the kind of industry standard practices towards password handling people's personal information, encrypting, securing traffic, things like that.
Brilliant. That makes sense. Thank you. So what about the wider security considerations then? So things like hackers, password attacks, and the general security of the system.
So B2C itself provides extensive protections. It's built on the same technology as Azure Active Directory, so it automatically monitors and handles threats like denial of service attacks, password spray attacks, brute force attacks. It also comes with identity protection, like we were talking about before, so making sure that my authentication is good, making sure that I am Dave, I am who I say I am. It can tie into Azure Monitor, Microsoft Sentinel as well, for things like monitoring and alerting when there's suspicious activity within the systems. It will tie into external systems as well, so you can raise events out to your existing SOC monitoring systems for when various different things are happening. All the access to the B2C backend is secured through the Azure portal and Azure Active Directory. So you've got your levels of role-based access control on top of that, any MFA you need. So that's all nice and secure. Wider, to B2C, we're typically talking about solutions that are hosted in Azure, because we tend to be focused on Microsoft solutions. And again, the back end of that tends to be accessible via the Azure portal, all secured with AAD, using role-based access control to restrict who's got access to what and when. We tend to use the principle of least privilege, so people should, for example, only have read access to things that they need to, escalating to write only when necessary, restricting access to different environments down to only the people that need access to those environments. So, for example, very limited set of support actors with access to production level systems. Most people just need access to like a dev or a test environment, that kind of stuff. Also, along with that is things like restricting traffic. So, databases generally don't need to be accessible to the wider internet, restricting all of the traffic down there so it's only accessible within the Azure solution. You have to go through like an API or something to make sure no one can just get access to the database, dump it out, get breaches, things like that. One of the things that we follow is the Microsoft Secure Development Lifecycle, which has a number of parts, but probably the most important, the one that we make the most use of, is threat modeling, which basically allows us just to model the solution, all the connections between the different components, and then that will come up with a list of potential threats that we can review and say, yes, we've dealt with those. We need to look into that one a little bit more. That one's out of scope, things like that. So it's a very handy checklist to say, are you considering everything you need to, like encryption at rest, like HTTPS, SQL injections, and so on and so forth.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave. That was all really informative and hopefully provides some food for thought for anyone else who's considering how this could possibly all fit into their own business too. I know that there's, excuse me, lots to think about, and certainly every customer that we work with has got different requirements and they've got different systems, but it's clear that there are some foundations that every identity solution should be built on. So hopefully this will allow our attendees today to kickstart the thought process. So I mentioned at the start that we would also have some time for a short Q&A session at the end. So I'm just going to pause for a wee second and hand over to my colleague Sandra and just see if there are any questions for Dave.
Thank you very much, Fiona and Dave. This was really informative. Just looking at the Q&A box, we've got a couple of questions, but please keep them coming, or if you want to ask our speakers anything on a one-to-one basis, you may do so as well. But first question we've got from Rachel. She says, this is all great information, but how does this ultimately help with customer experience, Dave?
So how does all of this, everything that we've talked about, help with your customers? Okay, so I guess to summarize, by knowing your users, you can ensure that your whole system makes sense to them, right? So how are they signing up and signing in? How are they then managing their data once they have signed up, signed in? What permissions are they going to get once they've signed into your system? Because, going back to what we said at the very start, it might be different depending on whether I'm external, whether I'm internal, whether I'm an individual customer, whether I'm someone acting on behalf of a business. So know your customers, you know how they want to use the system. Federation, that allows your customers to reuse their existing identities, right? So their Azure Active Directory, like their work account or their Google account or something like that. That means that you're reusing systems that users trust, so that they can have more trust of your system in turn. If you're requiring that they sign in with Google, well, they trust Google quite a lot, so they're then going to trust your system quite a lot. You can also reuse the information that's in those systems. So if I'm an external user who's already set up in my company's Azure Active Directory, I don't maybe need to re-enter all of my details to sign into your own application, right? You just get them from Azure Active Directory. It also means you've got less need to handle sensitive information like passwords. So again, if you're going off to Azure Active Directory, if you're going off to Google, user types a password in over there, you don't know anything about it. You don't need to worry about what happens if that password gets out. That's literally not your problem at that point. That's Google's problem. That's Microsoft's problem. So it helps reduce your burden and increase user trust. Third one's trust frameworks, right? So trust frameworks, we were saying it allows you to set down the steps that users go through that you can use to trust the users, but that also users can use to make sure that they're confident no one's going to take over their account, I guess. So it helps users protect their own identities. You know, if I set up an email and MFA, I can be relatively sure that someone's not going to get into my account versus just setting up email. The identity verification, so that document checking, you know, checking my passport, checking my driving license, again, that helps you be sure that I am Dave, I am who I say I am. I'm known to, I don't know, HMRC or DVLA or something. But it also, again, allows me to trust that you're treating my identity securely. You know, you need these checks for me to access your system. Now, they don't need to be checks that apply to every system. You know, if I'm accessing an e-commerce website again, then it doesn't really make sense for you to catch my driving license. But if I'm accessing a government department, maybe then that makes more sense. You know, more sensitive operations tend to be the ones that want identity verification checks. So again, it's increasing my, as a customer's, trust in your system and how you're using my data. Identity protection, again, you know, again, it increases my trust because that's the practical implementation of those trust frameworks. And again, it increases your trust that I am who I claim to be. Understanding your understanding of the location and use of data and all of that consolidation stuff. Again, it helps you with the data management. It makes you less prone to breaches. It makes you less prone to data misuse. You know, if you've got one or two places, like we said before, that you've got to kind of keep track of that data, you've got to kind of dictate the handling of, that's much easier to enforce than it is trying to cover a dozen different databases with a dozen different owners that have existed for 20 odd years. Now, it's hard to communicate that to users, right? Because you don't give away the internals of your system, but it kind of flows through into like GDPR and compliance and things and privacy statements and, you know, terms of use of the system. You know, you can describe to users much more easily how you're using their data and what that means, and they then in turn can be more confident that you're not misusing their data and that, you know, all of their rights through GDPR or whatever regulation you need to follow, all of their rights are being met. So again, it's about building up that trust and giving users kind of a concrete example of, here's what we're doing, here's a process that we're very confident that we're doing, so you can be very confident that we're following it. And finally, the security standards, again, it is more confidence around the handling of the system, the handling of the data, you know, making sure that everything that is private that needs to be, that's secure that needs to be. So increasing the user's trust in your system that their data is not going to be leaked. And a part of that, I suppose, you know, as well, we touched on a few points, but designing all of those processes with the user in mind, so it's usable as well as secure. You know, if no one's using it, it doesn't really matter how secure it is because there's no data in there. So you want it to be a mix of both secure and usable. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yes, thank you for this. I hope everyone was taking notes. The second question is a long one. I'll read it twice. Our customer data sits in Salesforce. We've got half a dozen different applications, each with their own database and users. How can everything you've talked about so far provide us with one system that people can sign into? So our customer data sits in Salesforce. We've got half a dozen different applications, each with their own database and users. How can everything you've talked about so far provide us with one system that people can sign into?
Yep. Okay. So we touched on this very, very briefly, but B2C ultimately, if we're looking at it from a very B2C focused point of view, B2C can act as that one central source for here's where the user data is coming from. It might not be where the user data is stored, but here's where the data is coming from for those various different applications. So whenever any of those applications need to access a user, they need to authenticate a user, they need to get user details, they go off to B2C in the B2C solution. It's then responsible for deciding, is that data coming from my own directory? Is it coming from Salesforce? Is it coming from these disparate data stores? Do we need those disparate data stores? Can that data in those data stores be moved all over into Salesforce, or a mix in Salesforce and B2C? Part of the process of building this solution is figuring out how we're going to migrate that data as well, right? So how are we going to take that data from those disparate data stores and move them into one or two places, Salesforce and B2C? What's the overlap? What is truly application specific and should stay in those data stores? And then how does that get tied up to B2C? So it's all about making B2C that one central place for accessing user data, for users to manage their own data, and to consolidate all that data as much as possible into. It also gives you one place for managing things like the user session. You know, when I sign into one of these apps, if I then go to sign into another, ideally I wouldn't enter my credentials again. So if you've only got B2C as the one central place, all of the apps redirect to B2C, and then B2C says, oh, you've already signed into this one over here. I see you're already signed in. I won't prompt you for credentials again. I'll just let you into that other app. The same as we were talking about, like with Azure AD and Google and things like that. So it allows you to give, again, a much more fluid, a much more easy to use process for users who are potentially using multiple apps within your ecosystem. And you've got one place for managing security, right? One place that's handling passwords, that's dealing with user data and things like that. One place that you have to focus really hard all of your, well, not all of your security effort, but the majority of your security effort, and then just make sure that the other parts are respecting that and doing things equally well.
Thank you for that. And that's all the questions in the Q&A box so far. But if you have any more questions, please get in touch. I'm going to hand over to Fiona now for the conclusion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Thanks, Sandra and Dave. And thank you very much to everyone else for joining us on the webinar today too. I hope that you also found the information and the session useful. Just as a final point to mention before we wrap things up today, so we're offering attendees of our webinar a free workshop which will take a bit of a deeper dive into the particular use cases for your own business and how we could possibly facilitate a B2C solution for you. So if this is something that you would be interested in knowing a little bit more about, or if you think of any further questions, as Sandra mentioned, that you'd like to ask us after the webinar, please do feel free to contact us using the details on screen, and you'll also get them in our follow-up email as well, along with a copy of the recording from today. So thanks very much again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.